Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's lecture, arranged by Center for Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. I'm your host, Naeem Mahmoud. Tonight, we are to have our first lecture on the series, Crash of Civilization, the History and Future of Western Modernity and the Islamicate. The series consists of 4 lectures, which will be delivered on a fortnightly basis. The aim of the series is to understand modernity better and also how it affected the Islamicate. Few words about the Center for Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. The Center for Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, CAMES in short, is a non-partisan organization based in London, promoting activities to understand Asia and Middle East better, and acts as a hub for engaging with the region's arts, culture, and politics. We engage through research and dialogue to facilitate a better understanding of these regions from socio-political and socio-economic viewpoints. Recently, we have undertaken several lecture series on terrorism, colonialism, Ottoman Empire, and Islamic civilization. We hope through these lectures, we shall be able to have a better understanding of the people, culture, and politics of Asia and the Middle East. The title of tonight's lecture is The History and Development of Western Modernity. The lecturer is Professor Saeed Khan. Saeed Khan is Associate Professor of Teaching in the Departments of Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies at Wayne State University, Detroit, Michigan, where he teaches Islamic and Middle East history, politics, and culture, and where he also is Director of Global Studies. His primary area of research is the identity politics of Muslim diaspora communities in the USA, UK, and Europe, and assessment of Western modernity and its discontents. He is also a research fellow at a Wayne State Center for the Study of Citizenship and is a founding member and a senior research fellow at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, ISPU, which is a Washington-based think tank. Professor Khan's most recent publications include the 2021 anthology, Global Studies, the Reader on Issues and Institutions, the co-authored 2020 book, What is Going on Here? US Experiences of Islamophobia Between Obama and Trump, and Fallacies of Foundational Principles, Rawls's Political Liberalism and Islamophobia in Reorient, March 2017. So that is a bit of intro of tonight's lecture. Now a few words about the format of the lecture tonight. We start with introduction, which I have just delivered. The next we'll go straight to the lecture itself, which will last around 30 to 45 minutes. The lecture will be then followed by Q&A session, which will last around 30 to 45 minutes as well. We observe a few rules. We ask our audience to keep mic and mobile muted until told otherwise. We encourage questions and comments, maintaining professional approach. We also encourage the attendees to take notes on the lecture for the comments and Q&A section. Now, without further ado, I'd like to ask Professor Saeed to deliver the lecture. Saeed, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Naeem. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us from wherever you might be. That's why I'm not going to say good evening or good afternoon or good morning, because I'm not sure exactly where you might be. You might be in many of these different places. But it's a pleasure to be communicating with you. And I want to thank the Center for Asian and Middle East Studies for not only their work, but also their vision for compiling a series of this sort on a subject that I hope you find to be both timely and relevant. Oftentimes, these kinds of topics seem to be a bit too esoteric, maybe too abstract. Hopefully, we will be able to distill it to something that shows relevance for everyone, both in the here and now and moving forward as Muslims, either living in the West or living anywhere in the world at this time, given the fact that the Western zeitgeist in some way, shape, or form prevails over all of us. Now, a little bit about terminology. When we're talking about modernity, And I think it's important to recognize that there are two other terms that are oftentimes synonymously placed with modernity. One is modernization, and the other is modernism. So I'd like to go ahead and, at least at the beginning, make sure that we're on the same page as we're looking at these very important terms. Modernity is actually essentially a state of being. And when we're talking about Western modernity, it is because the zeitgeist, or those who are dictating the current definition of modernity, happens to be the West. At one time, arguably 1,000 years ago, that could have been said about Islam or the Islamicate, that given its dominance in the world, that modernity back then would have been called Islamic or Muslim modernity. So we have to go ahead and understand then that it essentially is whomever is dictating it and whoever is defining it. It is in the state that we find ourselves. And to borrow from the German philosopher Hegel, who believed in the march of time and this positivistic view of history moving forward, we of course assume that tomorrow will be more advanced than the previous day. And again, we can certainly go ahead and unpack that assumption in the Q&A as well. But what about the other two terms? We have modernization, which, as the suffix suggests, is a process whereby we are becoming arguably more modern. Many will immediately and very reflexively regard this as a process of scientific and technological advancement. But I would suggest that we look beyond that. That, of course, is what is perhaps most visible and tangible. But arguably, modernization should include ideas or ideological advancement and evolution, where the human condition is therefore improved upon as time moves forward, that we learn from our mistakes, we rectify them, and we create situations that then remove barriers and limitations against people, particularly on what would be seen as social constructs like ethnicity, race, religion, gender, and so on. The third of these terms is modernism. And modernism, again, with the suffix, suggests that there is an ideology involved. And if there's an ideology involved, it means that it, by definition, would replace or supplant a different ideology. Now, I think as Muslims, it's fair to say that there's really no argument or really any kind of resistance or defiance that one can make regarding modernity itself. As I said before, it is the state in which we reside. Modernization is compatible with the Islamicate, and we can talk about in the next lecture the choices that Muslim societies could or would make if they were given the opportunity to decide the pace by which modernization could then enter their respective societies. Modernism, of course, is the one area that seems to have the most challenge for Muslims because it would be seen as an ideological system which is not one that is necessarily compatible with Islam. Its principles, its definitions, its contours would perhaps then be seen as anathema to Islam, both from a theological construct as well as I said before, an ideological construct. So we're talking about Western modernity here. And despite the fact that it is essentially the state in where we are, it does in fact have its own history. Now, the word modernity would suggest that its history is a rather short one, that perhaps modernity is relatively new as a phenomenon, maybe not just a 21st century phenomenon, but maybe the 20th century. Some might even argue that it is maybe a 19th century phenomenon, but not going any further back. But Western modernity actually has a history that dates back at least 500 years. In fact, most scholars and historians in examining modernity will place its inception somewhere around the early 16th century or the 1500s. And of course, as any historian will tell you, that there is no singular date by which we can say, this is the moment it started. We always have to extrapolate just a little bit further back in order to get a running start on understanding this era that then is known as the modern era in the Western imagination. So we will go to this image, which of course for Muslims is not only a very familiar one, but it is a very painful one. And if you look at the date here, it is an anniversary that only recently passed by. 11 days ago would have marked the 530th anniversary of the fall of Muslim Spain, or of Andalusia, or Al-Andalus. And here is the very iconic image of the last of the Nasirid sultans, Abu Abdullah, also known as Boabdil, relinquishing the keys to Granada to the dual monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, before he and his family were given safe passage from Granada. And in many ways, this date then can be seen as at least marking the inception of what is the modern age. For the Europeans, for the West, it was seen as a vindication. It was seen as the culmination of centuries of efforts to be made to remove Muslim influence, Muslim rule from the Iberian Peninsula. Obviously, depending on your definition of Europe, the Ottoman Empire was still occupying a good amount of Eastern Europe. But that also then calls into note the fact that we're talking about Western modernity here. And even Western Europeans do not necessarily hold Eastern Europe in that high regard. These are some of the internal issues regarding Europe. And again, makes for a very fascinating discussion of how we may perceive Europe as being the West, but even Europe perhaps does not define itself as such. Here we have, of course, Boabdil himself. With his surrender, he's also known as the person who made the Moor's last sigh as he was exiting the area. And here we have the monarchs who were responsible. The marriage between Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile and Leon then creates a merger of territory, a merger of armies, and a merger of purpose to then enter into the final reconquest or reconquista of Spain, a process that had begun really starting in the 11th century with attacks on Toledo and then on to Cordoba and Seville, to the point whereby the latter part of the 15th century, Muslim rule was far smaller than it had been at its inception in the year 711. But when we talk about 1492, and this of course then informs why this year is seen as being so pivotal in defining the modern era's beginning, it is also the year of Christopher Columbus. A very famous adage that every school child learns is, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, he did so with the help of Muslim navigators. In fact, at least 2 of his ships were commandeered by Muslim captains. A Genoese trader and explorer, he is commissioned by Ferdinand and Isabella to find new routes to Asia. Why? And here again, we find the inextricable link of the advent of modernity with the Islamicate. The motivation of this was to avoid the Ottoman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean, an area that was, of course, then controlling access to trade farther afield. Columbus, of course, did not reach Asia. He reaches the Caribbean, one of the reasons why he calls it the Indies. But it's also important to realize the underwriting of the trip was due to confiscated property of both Jews and Muslims that were living in Spain at the time. Muslims literally funded and financed the so-called age of discovery and the advent of the modern era in the West. And it's interesting to see then that how deeply embedded this notion of the Muslim is in the early stages of the formation of the Western modern. In fact, for those of you who have read it, Don Quixote is regarded as being the first modern novel. Miguel de Cervantes not only creates this masterpiece, but it is a masterpiece with a narrative that has Muslims there, but never discussed openly. For example, when Quixote and Sancho Panza, his sidekick, are journeying through the land near La Mancha, he comes upon a ghost town. And you realize that this ghost town was one that was ethnically cleansed, ostensibly of Muslims. The silences in the book are quite telling because, in fact, those are filled with the Islamicate. It's also important to remember that in the book, Don Quixote represents a country gentleman who is almost drawn insane by what he sees as the lack of civility and the old way. Another way to see this is a person who lamented the loss of the Muslim adab, the etiquette that Muslims had when it came to Spain, something that was lost under Catholic rule. And so many festivals in Spain then coincide with commemorating the defeat of the Muslims and also then the reascension of Catholicism. Well, why is this an important point? Because again, as we are often told, Europe is supposed to be ostensibly a secular continent. And yet when it comes to the cultural elements of Christianity, not only are they on full display through their parades and their festivals, but they are done so in a form of almost militant vengeance to assert the conquest over Muslims. This is then, again, one of those foundational elements of the European modern. Of course, when we're talking about the loss of Muslim rule, it unfortunately is accompanied by the Spanish Inquisition. This was an effort to try to identify those within the ranks of being heretics. Christians were not spared, but Jews and Muslims certainly bore the brunt of this effort that was undertaken by the Catholic Church, by such maniacal individuals like the Grand Inquisitor Torquemada. And it's interesting to see how various tests of loyalty were done, particularly on people who were thought to have converted. They were then given trials by ordeal. Jews and Muslims were forced to eat pork in public to see if they had in fact accepted Christianity, were forced to drink wine. Even their water usage was monitored. If a Muslim family, for example, was using the same amount of water that they had before conversion, there was a strong suspicion that they hadn't really converted, that they were still performing the ablution and in fact performing the 5 daily prayers in Islam on the down low in private. That convert or leave then transitioned to convert or die in Spain. And here, of course, we see a picture of the majestic Alhambra. That rectangular building in the middle was not part of the original Nasrid Palace. That is actually the palace of Charles V, who then erected that in a very inorganic way. It really doesn't go with the rest of the palace, but as an assertion that the Muslims had been defeated and that Catholicism and Christian Spanish rule now prevailed. Now, Charles V was a fascinating character because he was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And at the same time, he was having issues with some of the changes that were occurring throughout Europe at the time. He takes over in 1519 as the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, 2 years after, and we will talk about this in great detail, the first efforts to defy the church by way of protest really starts to gain traction. He has conflicts over power and politics with France, as well as with Martin Luther, the person who was bringing about these protests. And he also had tensions with the Ottomans. And part of the reason for this is that the Ottomans recognized the plight not only of the Muslims in Spain at the time, but also of the Jews. And it was the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II who sent ships to Spain to rescue over 100,000 Muslims and Jews, giving them safe sanctuary within the Ottoman Empire. In fact, among the Jewish community of Turkey today and parts of former Turkey like Salonika in Greece, the Sephardic Jews are the ones that, that exist there. And so it's really interesting to see that kind of shift from Spain to another Muslim sovereign state where even Jews could enjoy stability, safety, and security. Charles V was not necessarily an inveterate Islamophobe. He may have had issues with the Ottomans, but he felt perfectly comfortable enacting and entering into treaties with Persia. This is at a time when the Safavid Empire, started by Shah Ismail I, was now coming to its own, and he realized that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so given the conflicts that he had with the Ottomans, he figured it would be a good idea to then create alliances with Persia. Now, I mentioned before that there was tension with France. Here we have Francois I. And Francois was a contemporary of Suleiman the Magnificent in the Ottoman Empire. So I want you to understand that as the modern era is beginning in the West, in Western Europe, there is interaction, and it is an interaction that is certainly strategic on the part of some of the major actors of the West. Charles V, as I mentioned, with Persia, and here we have Francois or Francis forging an alliance with the Ottoman Empire. Why? Well, quite simply, because Francis was beleaguered by Charles V. So it's interesting to see then the two major Western forces on the continent of Europe are both creating alliances with different Muslim sovereignties farther to the east. This was also a time where, again, when the modern era begins, religious tolerance was not very high. It may shock many to understand this, but at the time of Francois, full membership of the state, or we now would call it citizenship, was denied to Protestants. French Protestants were known as Huguenots, who fled to England for sanctuary, and also for Jews. And really full emancipation or citizenship was not granted to religious minorities in France until the French Revolution. In fact, 1791, and more codified by 1792 with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is important when we consider some of the claims that countries like France make today of being the exemplars of modernity, the exemplars of liberalism, and yet their treatment of religious minorities, particularly Muslims, is, one would argue, on the one hand, not very modern at all. But then when we take a look at this longer arc of the history of modernity, we can even make the argument that they are being painfully consistent to how they were at the very start of modernity. And then we have Henry V, or I'm sorry, Henry VIII, I'm wrong Shakespearean play. Very interesting because his in-laws were actually Ferdinand and Isabella. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. And this was very common to have these alliances forged by marriage. And in fact, she tried very desperately to get Henry to go on sides with her nephew, Charles V, in the conflict against France that was occurring in the continent. But unfortunately, Catherine had her own issues with Henry VIII, or vice versa. She bore him a daughter, Mary, who therefore was not as eligible as a male heir to the throne. And as a result of it, Henry sought to annul the marriage because at the time he was a Catholic. Divorce was not allowed by the church. The church naturally denied his request. So Henry VIII very petulantly then founded his own church so that he could therefore terminate the marriage. Went on to marry Anne Boleyn, and then 4 other wives after that also occurred. But it's interesting to see Henry within this context because, in fact, he decides to rebel against the Catholic Church, but for purely personal and some would say rather prurient reasons. But here is somebody who is, as I would like to say, the very first person to break up a monopoly in world history. If we think about the Catholic Church as a corporation, as this large property owner and landowner, a conglomerate that's very complex, in today's day and age in corporate law, we hear these terms called antitrust laws to break up a company that's too big. This is being considered for such companies as Facebook or even Amazon today. Well, in many ways, Martin Luther was involved in an antitrust movement to break up the monopoly of the Catholic Church over both the political as well as the theological lives of Christians. He was a priest, he was an author, he was a theologian, and he was a very harsh critic of the Catholic Church. He felt that it had gone into a state of disrepute, it had become very corrupt, and because it had a monopoly on the life of the faithful, they had no escape. Particularly vexing for him was the church's nefarious practice of the sale of indulgences. You could literally buy yourself a pardon for your sins, and of course that meant that the wealthy could do so with impunity, whereas the poor had no choice, and they were going to be addled with sin. So in 1517, he takes that and 94 other complaints, and he posts them on the door to the church in Wittenberg, Germany. This becomes known as the 95 Theses, and they then form the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, which arguably is the single most significant event in certainly European or Western history, but also really then marks the point where the modern era is indisputably commenced. Luther's ideas then depart from the church, where he says that salvation can be achieved by faith alone, as opposed to the Catholic Church's insistence that it was faith and good works. He talks about the Bible being the only authority, not priests, not any other intermediaries, and certainly not the Pope. And he also believes that the priesthood is of all believers, not just the hierarchy and the structure of the church. Well, as you can imagine, the church didn't take this very well. And in 1521, Charles V convenes what is known as the Diet of Worms. And that isn't a meal, by the way. And an edict is passed by Charles V, which bans Luther's writings, declares him to be a heretic and an enemy of the state, and Luther is promptly excommunicated or thrown out of the Catholic Church. There were calls to have him executed, burned at the stake, but Charles V didn't want to make a martyr of him. But this becomes a defining feature for European history moving forward for at least a century and a half, at this rather critical period as modernity is starting to germinate in that continent. The Council of Trent takes place. It lasts for 18 years, but it essentially is a confab designed to serve as a counter-reformation called upon by the Catholic Church. And it is here that the council then condemns heresies, and particularly those that are being committed by those who subscribe to what Luther is saying, i.e. Protestants, those who are protesting the church. The church then also, through the council, doubles down on what it says are the church's key features, doctrines, and teachings. Now, it would be one thing if this was a mere back and forth of conferences, councils, debates, and decrees. But the Protestant Reformation now is really gaining a lot more steam in Europe, And in 1618, nearly or just a little over a century after Luther initially had nailed those complaints to the door of his local church, Europe is plunged into the 30 Years' War. Now, it's important to know about these wars for several reasons. One, because of how absolutely malevolent they were in European history. Here we see that it was Emperor Ferdinand II who tried to force Catholicism on the entire Holy Roman Empire, that area that you see there on the graph, which is in purple and orange, a little bit of green and yellow, essentially the area of the German and Prussian lands. But it embroiled all of Europe. Europe was in the midst of true wars of religious intolerance and conflict. 4 to 12 million people died as a result of it within 30 years. That represents 20% of the European population. This figure was tantamount to what had happened to Europe 2.5 centuries earlier with the Black Death, the plague. But it also created enough disruption that combat was not the only cause of casualty. Disease and famine went rampant. Now, why is this important? Well, quite simply because every time Muslims are embroiled in a conflict, especially those which involve sectarian difference, we find that Muslims are made to feel as though they and they alone waged war based on religious difference. Whereas, of course, in this very pivotal moment of European history, that is exactly why the wars were waged. So a talking point to be sure to go ahead and consider. Well, the war finally comes to an end, and it does so through what is known as the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. And here we find a lot of consequences. For example, the weakening of Austria and Spain. Now, why is this important? Well, Austria and Spain were two Catholic countries. France, being a Catholic country, was strengthened as a result, and it therefore becomes the most important and strongest of the Catholic states within Europe. There's also an independence of the German princes from the Holy Roman Empire, which now starts to collapse. And at least ostensibly, there is an end to religious wars in Europe. Now, on the one hand, we can say that that is certainly, from the standpoint of Europe, a point of indignation to say that they had solved the problem. All it did was it recast any future wars to be ones that were fought in the name of secular reasons. Conflict did not in and of itself end. It just morphed or transitioned into some other narrative under which it was being fought. This is important, I would argue, because when it comes to Muslims and conflicts that they may have, they are not accorded the same kind of agency to define the reasons for their wars. If Muslims are fighting, there is a presumption that they are fighting based on a religious motivation, not for some of the same exact reasons that would have been the impetus for post-Westphalian wars in Europe. There is the introduction of a peace summit, the idea of having diplomatic discussions to prevent or to end conflicts. And by and large, we find that the Catholic Church is no longer, after Westphalia, a dominant political force within Europe. But there are other consequences that come about from the Peace of Westphalia. First of all, it is actually this treaty which sets the stage for the concept of the modern nation state, one of the hallmark features of Western modernity. Because of the brutality of the wars and because of the impetuses for them, meaning religious difference, what happens with Europe is this new idea. People coming together and forming new nation states or sovereignties based upon common and shared characteristics, whether it is language, ethnicity, race, religion, or religious denomination. It creates then a solution to Europe's constant and perpetual fighting by creating sameness, creating homogeneity, saying that as long as you have then people who are on the same page, that is arguably a way to minimize conflict. The second major result of the Peace of Westphalia is the secularization of Europe. And again, we can certainly discuss what do we mean by secularization. At its very fundamental level, we mean having a religious authority separated from that of political authority. It also, at least on its surface, provides the promise or the hope of religious tolerance in Europe. Now, again, those words are in inverted commas for a very good reason. It was a goal, it was an objective. It didn't necessarily mean that that was something that was attained. Or, to put it another way, it could have still existed as the underlying impetus implicitly, while the conflict was perhaps recast in some other narrative. So after the 30 Years' War, what does Europe have to show for itself? Well, first of all, there's a disillusionment with organized religion. And I'd like for you to take a look at this list because it serves as an interesting checklist when it comes to our future lectures and these questions that are oftentimes asked. Why doesn't Islam or the Islamicate have a reform? One of the questions that I'm oftentimes asked by non-Muslim audiences when I'm asked to lecture is, and I'm sure you've probably heard this as well, does Islam need a Martin Luther? The, of course, assumption there is, does Islam need a reformer? Does it need a mujaddid? And I'm always fascinated and I'm always eager to accept the invitation to these lectures. They're usually at churches. And I always start the same way. I walk in and I said, you've asked me to answer the question, does Islam need a Martin Luther? And I stopped right there and I said, could you first of all tell me what is the denomination of this church? And they look a bit confused and sometimes they'll say, well, does it matter? And I said, well, yes, it does. And please indulge me. And they'll tell me, oftentimes these are Protestant denominations. And then they'll come back and they'll say, why did you ask? And I said, well, if you're a Catholic church, then Luther is a villain. If you're a Protestant church, then Luther is a hero of some kind. So I want to first of all establish, when you're asking me, do we Muslims need a Luther? I want to know what you mean by a Martin Luther. That helps then reframe the entire discussion. And it shows you the importance that if there's a question that is being posed, that we're not obliged to accept the premise of the question. I then go in and I said, well, Luther changed a lot of things. Do you want him to be a theological reformer in Islam? Do you want him to be a cultural reformer in Islam? Do you want him to be a political reformer in Islam? And usually by that point, they have no idea, because for them, saying a Muslim Luther is just a soundbite. It's just a talking point that they make. But it's important to go ahead and point those things out to such audiences. What we find, though, is there's a disillusionment with organized religion. And here we're talking about the Catholic Church. It is one of the reasons why then Protestantism is so decentralized. Well, the question we have to ask ourselves as Muslims is, did the Muslim world or did the Islamicate suffer such disillusionment? Maybe so on a microaggression level, but certainly the question is, did it occur on the macro level? Was there a decline in state-sponsored religion in the Islamicate in the way that it now was after the 30-year wars in Europe? I think the answer to that question, again, is no. A decline in church influence was palpable in Europe. Well, here, of course, what do we mean by church influence? In the Islamicate, the notion of sovereign political authority always reigned supreme, whether it was in the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, or the Mughal Empire. So this is really one of those questions that I suppose could be answered as not applicable. Greater religious freedoms by some states in Europe, well, that's certainly something in a positive direction. But we have to remember that under the Abbasids, there were entire provinces that were run by non-Sunni forces, the Fatimids, for example, in Egypt and Syria. Even the Abbasid Caliphate had as its support behind it from 945 to 1055, the Buyids, a Shi'i Persian aristocratic tribe. So this idea then about even the sectarian complexities of Islam in some of its pivotal moments of history need to be demonstrated and asserted as different from the historical trajectory of church and state authority and conflict in Europe. The weakening of the concept of the divine right of kings, or and put in another way, the belief that all monarchs had been put into power by the will of God and were not subject to earthly power. Well, of course, from a Muslim perspective, there is the belief that everything is as God wills it. But the idea of having some kind of immunity from terrestrial accountability has never been part of Islamic thought. And certainly we see in the history of the Caliphate, even going with examples of Omar, there was an insistence of accountability, even for the highest echelons of political authority. And the last point, as far as consequences of the 30-Year War, birth of individualism and the rise of skepticism. So now we're really starting to see the development of some of the features of the modern, of which we're familiar. And of course, these were key features of the Enlightenment as well. So when we are looking at the Protestant Reformation, this pivotal moment, which really not only brings about, at the very least, it catalyzes something that had begun with the fall of Muslim Spain 25 years earlier. We find then that several factors that we are familiar with emerge from this. Now, how much there is a direct causal link is something we can certainly debate and discuss, but suffice it to say that it is very difficult to imagine that without the Protestant Reformation, any of these phenomena would have emerged. The Enlightenment, colonialism, secularism, the Industrial Revolution, capitalism, liberalism, and the new battle lines of centralized versus decentralized authority. It's, again, hard to imagine that without Protestantism, any of these would occur. The Protestant Reformation and the onset of protest against the Catholic Church dismantled that one immutable object, the Catholic Church. And once that occurred, it created essentially a freewheeling idea in Europe that if such a powerful authority, and one that of course had a sacred component to it, dealing with people's theological well-being and afterlife, if that can be challenged, if that can be diluted, if that can be defeated, then what can it open up? It is why then this was seen as an emancipation, or why it is framed as a liberation theology. Well, the problem from an Islamicate standpoint is if there is nothing from which one needs to be freed, of what use are all of these? So as we're then moving into the development of modernity, particularly as it starts to gain steam after the 30 Years' War, because it is after that that we find all of these other developments, including the advent of the Enlightenment, the advent of industrialization, the further advancement of colonization and colonialism and secularization. We ask ourselves, what then are the main characteristics of modernity? And for this, I thought we would consult the Canadian scholar at McGill University, Charles Taylor, who wrote the book, A Secular Age. For Taylor, he defines modernity, and again, looking at it really strictly through a Western lens, and see how he privileges modernity to this definition, meaning that even if an argument was made that Muslims had their own form of modernity 1,000 years ago, none of these characteristics really can be said to apply. A market economy, well, maybe we can make that argument about the Abbasid Empire having one. A public sphere, a robust area for private sector deliberation, yes, that happened. but a self-governing people. This is something that again, even as Taylor defines these as modernity, it means that he's contradicting the very history of modernity. When modernity begins in Europe and the beginning of the 16th century, it was hardly a market economy. The public sphere was deeply suppressed because of the sovereign and also by the church. And hardly we can go ahead and say that the people of Europe were a self-governing one, given empire and monarchy being the dominant political forces there. So the question then becomes, when it comes to modernity, what other factors are either presumed or are asserted as being key features? Secularism, democracy, liberalism? It's very hard to make that argument. It is beyond the scope of this lecture series. Perhaps we can unpack, Naeem, some of these into their own modules. A lecture series on Enlightenment philosophy, a lecture series on capitalism, a lecture series on secularism, and a lecture series on political liberalism, in order to give due justice and attention to them. But we have to ask these questions that if we were to delve into the works of some of the so-called sacred voices of modernity and the Enlightenment, people like John Locke, people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, people like Thomas Hobbes and Immanuel Kant, were they really talking about the secular? Were they really talking about democracy? Were they really talking about liberalism as we now understand it? Or were they simply talking about a presumption of Christianity? Were they talking about a presumption of the sovereign, as Hobbes does in the Leviathan? And how secular is a society if the baseline of a Christian culture still dominates? How liberal is a society when there is no democracy? And even if there was a democracy, what form would that really take? The Enlightenment was very ambiguous about these things, and clearly they were not at the inception of the Western project of modernity. With that, I would like to welcome any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Excellent, Saeed. Thank you so much for the lecture. To be honest, it's full of information, and sometimes I guess there were some terminologies which I guess more to the academia than in our normal audiences conversation. So I guess that might be not so intimidating to some people. So I hope our audience have taken notes on the lecture, and they have their questions in mind. I would ask them to raise your hand at the in the Zoom raising hand section. That would really help us to prioritize who we should give the floor to raise the questions. So that would really help us. Also, you can write your questions down to the chat. We'll have a look at that, and if possible, we'll place it to the Professor Saeed. Right. So I guess all of us have so many questions, and let's start with mine first, Saeed. I have a few questions for you. As I told you earlier, because this is one of my favorite topics. You see, we talked about earlier in our WhatsApp group about Culture Smith's, right? His thought of political theology, and his
I'm sorry, who?
Culture Smith's.
Yes.
Yeah. So what he said, Culture Smith says in his political theology, and I quote, all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state and secularized, let me elaborate a bit more, it's just not on my screen properly. So all significant concepts of modern theory of the state are secularized theological, which is Christian concepts, whereby, for example, the omnipotent God became the omnipotent lawgiver. So this is my question is, why did the rest of the non-European, non-Christian countries have to deal with modernity and nation-state system, which is essentially European, non-Asian or other part? Yeah.
Right, and yeah, thanks for that question, Naeem. I mean, this gets down to one of the biggest, I suppose, systemic challenges that Muslims have when it comes to Western modernity. and that is in the way that it was deployed to Muslims. And we'll certainly pick up with this in the next lecture in a fortnight, as well as Muslim responses to it. But when colonization came to the Muslim world and other worlds, the so-called other, it did not come to emancipate, which was, of course, the stated principle, virtue, and value of modernity and modern liberalism, that it was all about the individual and their ability to emancipate themselves from various structures. Well, first of all, this was inorganic in the Muslim world because, quite frankly, the Muslim world didn't have issues with its existing structures. But this was a way for the West to come in as an excuse, the so-called white man's burden, to then gain its foothold in a rather competitive way vis-a-vis one another. I think what we sometimes forget about colonization, because it was such a brutal project, is in many ways, of course, it does target Muslims. But in another way, it was actually really not about Muslims. It's like in The Godfather, that to say this isn't personal, it's strictly business. This was a rivalry between European powers to control markets and control resources. And their decision on how to do that then led to the pieces on the board being Muslims and other people in Africa, Asia, and in Latin America. And as a result of it, we find that, isn't it ironic that as the nation state is starting to germinate in Western Europe, it is being denied in places throughout the Islamicate. In fact, the one example where the nation state was being actively encouraged was in a way to break up or severely weaken a Muslim empire, and that is the Ottoman Empire. In 1804, the spasm of nationalism is asserted and encouraged for the Serbian people. And between 1821 and 1829, it is similarly done so with the Greeks. One could make an argument that a form of Arab nationalism predated World War I with the French patronage of Christians in the Levant, trying to persuade them that they should see themselves as something outside or beyond the Ottoman Empire, and that they would be cared for by France. But in no situation do we see then the nation state being deployed in Muslim areas. Now, when it finally is, particularly after World War I with the mandate system, we know the results of this. The lines on the map are carved out in the most bizarre and perverse artistry for the purposes of the West. We see this being the fine example of chaos in the Middle East, where the way that Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Iraq are all carved out in nonsensical borders and boundaries, and the troubles that has caused, certainly the same thing happening in Africa. So if there is a sense of skepticism, if there is a sense of cynicism that the West has given to the Muslim world or the Islamicate, it seems as though it's perfectly justified. And the point that you made as far as invoking Schmitt, the idea of the omnipotent lawgiver being the sovereign state, that is completely incompatible with Islamic thinking. And so as a result of it, the very idea of the nation state model as the West would have wanted it deployed was simply not going to happen. Yes, if Muslim countries would have been given the option, and if they would have had the agency to decide how that should then be created, it could be a completely different conversation. One could make the argument that that is the conversation happening in Iran today.
Excellent. Excellent. We've got a couple of questions here. One from Iftikhar Malik. Iftikhar, go ahead, unmute yourself and raise a question, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Saeed, for a very clear, precise, wonderful lecture based on lots of historical facts. I do agree with your background of the lecture related with Muslim Spain and the Ottomans. I would go still further in history and say, I think perhaps the Crusades were the earliest process which initiated Europe into not only confronting the Muslim world, but also in sort of understanding the Muslim world or misunderstanding the Muslim world. And then I would say that, you know, travelers like Marco Polo, you know, because he traveled not just across the Silk Road, but through India, Iran, and modern-day Turkey. And he was the first one to write about the assassins. So I think there were these avenues. And you know, my recent book, the first chapter is about Abelard, who was from Bath here in England. And he went and lived in Syria for 7 years, learned Arabic, and translated Khwarizmi, and translated many of the Greek classics from Arabic into Latin, and sort of reintroduced West European or European knowledge along with the Muslim knowledge into Europe. So I would go further. I mean, that was the time when the first crusade started, and Abelard from Bath was in Syria in early 11th century. But my feeling is that something that you did not mention, maybe you want to mention it in your next lecture, is that many Muslims consider modernity synonymous with westernization.
Yeah.
And because of the long-standing bitterness or what you call the hesitation of accepting Western hegemony and Western civilization, Muslims have been very reluctant to accept the fact that modernity could be very universal. And if it in its recent reincarnation, it is West-dominated, Europe-dominated, nothing wrong with that. Because Professor Fazlur Rahman wrote about it, you know, a fellow Pakistani, who said that Islam had the capability of reinventing and reforming or modernizing itself at different stages. And W.C. Smith also talked about it, you know, when he talked about the issues, the crises, the 4 major crises that Muslims face. But my worry is that it's a big topic, and I'm glad that, you know, the center is taking it up. Because when I look at the West, it is very much ahead of us in education, knowledge, science, whatever, you know, modernity, as you talked about. And then you look towards your East, Japan, China, South Korea. And what is left behind is the Muslim world. Yeah. Whether you look at Muslim parts of Africa or Middle East, South Asia, and to some extent, Southeast Asia. And I have worked and traveled across Central Asia. So we are a big package and we are left out. And largely, I think, because of those bitter memories, and also because of our hesitation to accept all the modernist concepts, inventions, traditions that we are not ready to absorb, and we consider them to be very alien. So we are sort of at a crossroad. At one level, we want to modernize. We want to be like the Chinese, like South Koreans, like the Japanese, if not like the Europeans. But at the same time, maybe we're so concerned or scared that we will become proto-European, will get westernized. So I think this conflict between modernity and westernization is a key to the very understanding of this dichotomy that we Muslims are confronted with. And I think this is something which has to be addressed. And that is where I think your point is very valid, that Islam had the capacity and the tradition of modernizing itself according to the exigencies of the time. But I think in the last 300-400 years, we have lost it. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, it's an honor. And in fact, your book, Islam and Modernity, Key Points, is one that I assign in my Islam and Modernity and the Challenger Modernity graduate class. So I do hope you're getting the royalties for that. And your points are fully well taken. And in fact, you're rather prescient, because these are the issues that we're looking to cover in the subsequent 3 lectures. Islam's encounter with modernity and its responses. One of them, as you well know, is a term that was coined by Jalal Ali Ahmed in Iran, which is gharb zadagi, intoxication of the West, or West toxification, which became a rallying cry and an impetus, particularly in the national movement of Mehdi Bazargan and Ali Shariati against the Shah, and something that continues. Today, one could argue that that terminology has shifted as being anti-neoliberalism, and again we can unpack that. But also these luminaries like Afghani and Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida, Sir Saeed Ahmed Khan, and even the Deoband movement, all looking at responses to the imposition of a certain kind of modernity. We hope to bring that up in the subsequent lectures, as well as, I think, this rather important point you made. What other modernities are going to be offered to Muslims? And as you said, are we going to have to concede that in any case, we are not going to have the agency to be the architects of our own destiny? And do we just simply go and shop around? I mean, it's like, for example, buying a car. When your own country doesn't produce one, you're limited only to buying a foreign car. That might be the fate. The other point that you made regarding when does modernity start, I do take your point well regarding the Crusade, but I would respectfully say that there's a distinction here between the Muslim Western encounters and this point of where we would say modernity from a Western perspective begins. After all, I mean, one of the great indisputable contributions to the formation of the West, at least intellectually, came by way of Spain, where Ibn Rushd influences both Maimonides and Aquinas. But it seems as though a turn happens once the Black Death comes through and Europe hits rock bottom. And then with its gains and reformulations with Spain, that modernity has more legs. And the fact that, as I said before, the Protestant Reformation is so consequential, I think it would be really helpful for Muslims to understand that better. But thank you so much. And again, thank you for being on today's webinar. I really appreciate that.
Oh, thank you, Iftikhar Malik and Saeed for elaborating that part. One question is on the chat. Does the professor believe that most Western politicians are aware of this history when they talk about Islam and its backwardness, taking all credit for themselves and modernization in thought and materialism by attributing this to Western Europe essentially?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Given the caliber of politicians that I see today, both in America and in places like Great Britain and France, I'm not sure how much reading they've really done of any sort. I would argue that the curriculum itself reinforces a very exceptionalistic and exaltive narrative about the West. Which is, I suppose, the prerogative of any society to herald its victories and its attributes, but it does so at a very terrible cost, and that is a neglect of more important questions and inquiries. One of those, of course, being causation. It's one thing to go ahead and feel as though one's ascension and superiority and supremacy is self-evident. But then when you don't understand the cause and effect of how one gets there, when things start to have a wobble, which they invariably do, there is not then the intellectual sustainability of understanding how to diagnose issues. And I think that that's one of the reasons that I'm fascinated by charting and mapping and problematizing modernity from a Western perspective, because as a Muslim who's lived in the so-called West his entire life in Great Britain and then now in the United States, I find that the average Westerner doesn't have a sense of how things became the way that they did. And when we find disruptions, they engage in what are known as moral panics. And when moral panics occur, there is a sense of acting out. And oftentimes the acting out is against the wrong targets. If we want to understand Islamophobia as a pathology, I would argue that part of it is because the West is not intellectually honest enough to recognize that the flaws are not ones that are caused by Muslims or the Islamicate, but expose and reveal some fundamental systemic flaws of the project of modernity itself. For example, it seems as though the universality of modern values and virtues, liberalism, democracy, always seem to then have to be qualified or relitigated when it comes to Muslims. That I find to be, again, a very compelling issue. So as far as the leadership today, I don't believe that they have ever gone through a curriculum that adequately vets, examines, and critiques the issues of modernity, because they go to elite universities that tend to then simply validate and legitimize histories which are, like any other histories, very mortal, very human, and deeply complex.
Great. I'm sure we will have more questions. I think Nofal has one already, but before going to that, Saeed, I have a question to you. You mentioned that the outcome of Protestantism is so many things: Enlightenment, colonialism, and secularization, capitalism, liberalism, democracy. How about Orientalism? Do you think it was part of that project as well?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Orientalism, and we were talking earlier about Edward Said. Orientalism was a lens that the West created in order to distinguish itself from the other, to define the other, and then ultimately to dominate the other. Even what's sometimes called benign Orientalism, meaning a kind of fetishistic curiosity for the exotic, is very loaded. My only issue, though, when it comes to Edward Said's seminal work is I always ask the question that could he claim immunity from being an Orientalist himself, given his rather rich and very elite academic pedigree that was Western, going to, for example, St. George's in Palestine, Victoria College in Egypt, and then coming to Northfield, Mount Hermon prep school in America, followed by Princeton and Harvard. I mean, how do you stay immune from that kind of glorification, normalization, validization of the West? You'd have to be superhuman to be able to do that. But the idea then about how Orientalism fits so conveniently into the projects of colonization and imperialism is something that we can certainly talk about in the next lecture.
Right. We have a question from Nofal. Given that history of modernity can be traced to European roots and being directly influenced and shaped by movements happening in Europe, could modernity be universal?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Nofal. So here, again, with the title that we had, we're trying to qualify it as Western modernity. Every society goes through its own trajectory of modernity, provided it has agency to do so. I mean, even, for example, the Aztecs, who were ultimately overrun by the Spanish conquistadors, had a sense of modernity. They had a progress within, or an intra-societal progress of modernity. They were just simply confronted with a force that was superior to them militarily. And part of that military superiority was also weaponry, because they had muskets. So the idea of modernity in a broader sense of the word being universal, absolutely. And here I think you're touching on a very important point about the idea of when we're talking about modernity today, we have to remember that in parentheses, that means Western modernity. And so when the question then is being posed by the West, that what is the problem with the Islamicate? Why can they not modernize? Is a question that they cannot because they don't want to, they cannot because they are simply incapable because of some inferiority, or is it that they simply don't or cannot attain Western modernity because it doesn't fit within either their experience, their history, their context, or their aspirations? That, I think, is the important question, that the presumptuousness that the modernity of Western modernity is the only modernity that ever mattered or ever existed is one that we hope to unpack with this series as well. So again, I think modernity is universal because there's no other choice but for modernity to exist. The question is that whether a model of modernity is in fact universal. And as we are moving toward the possibility of new forms of modernity being asserted by, say, China in this 21st century, we need to then try to ascertain, number one, what does that really mean? How is it defined? What is the power structure that not only creates it, but perpetuates it? And what does that mean to the Islamicate as far as compatibility?
Oh, thank you, Saeed. I have got another questions. I hope our audience will have more questions too. Please feel free to raise your hands or write your questions down to the chat if possible.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me just follow up with Naufel's other question about how do I define universal modernity then? Is it value-based? I think it is always value-based, Naufel. I think from an Islamic standpoint, the conceit is that Islamic modernity or Islamic anything is universal and it is also eternal. But of course, it then has to be seen within its proper context. There's an evolution of Islamic law, of Islamic policies to address new realities based on certain principles that can be applied to those new realities. Now, of course, some of the debates that we have are about fundamentalists versus modernists when it comes to whether we apply a particular interpretation and application of law throughout time and make that universal and eternal, or is it the legal system and the apparatus of fiqh jurisprudence that is a universal principle in Islam? So we have to be very judicious in how we define these universalities.
So could you comment on the questions, I guess, a point raised by Dr. Abdul Bari?
Yeah, have you touched upon the role of Christian missionaries on the issue of modernity? No, and the reason for that, Bari Saab, is I think that's going to be a point that we will be touching on in the next lecture about modernity's encounter with the Islamicate.
Excellent.
So you're not, you haven't joined late, you've actually just joined early for the next lecture.
Right. So I hope we'll have a few more questions because we'll be finishing at 7:30. So we've got roughly around 12 minutes or so. I've got a question for you, Saeed. And as we have come to know that modernity has been through a historical process, right? It has seen a lot of things, and then has developed over the decades and centuries, and evolved a lot. But it looks like the development of modernity has been quite unfair to the rest of the world when it was imposed through colonialism and other European interventions, military interventions, cultural and other interventions. So and they also were quite unfair as well with dealing with history. Hallaq also said in his book, The Impossible State, that there is in fact no history other than Euro-American history, right? No even pre-Enlightenment European history as well. So that means that in modernism discourse, we don't see any place of Islam, Muslims, or any other religion, or any other people other than Europe. So how is that possible? And why is those discussions are not there? Is it because? But in the end, we had to bear the consequences of that modernism, right? In the end.
Well, this is the willful erasure of the other from the establishment of the West. And I mean, this is a massive debate that's going on right now, that would it be more, shall we say, helpful for the West to understand itself if it reintroduces these missing chapters? I started the lecture by invoking Don Quixote and about this idea of Quixote and Sancho Panza traveling through a ghost town. Well, I mean, would it not be helpful for a reading of Cervantes' epic novel to know that ghost towns don't just exist as ghost towns? They, by their very definition, suggest that somebody was living there. Would there not at least be that kind of human curiosity to figure out who was there before and why did they leave? What were the circumstances? The fact that the West feels as though they're the architects of a project exercising complete self-reliance, that they didn't need anyone else or any help to do that, I mean, is an absurdity. But you see this happening again and again and again, almost as though because of the proprietary interest of knowledge and taking credit, that is a hallmark of Western modernity. They don't want to give credit to Muslims because that means they're going to have to give Muslims commission or royalty for it. The very famous historian of science, Thomas Kuhn, who gives us the term the paradigm shift. If you read his history of science, I mean, it's very, very rich, but it's very, very incomplete. He just simply avoids talking about the massive and undeniable contribution of Muslim or Islamicate science. I don't know how anyone can do that. I mean, it is beyond reckless. It is. If I were grading a paper for somebody who was doing research, I would have to flunk them because they left out something that was so crucial and so vital. And yet you see this happening again and again and again, that there does not want to be any recognition of non-Western European agency in creating the West. Slowly but surely, you're finding that the scholarship now is demonstrating that this is an incontrovertible and for Europe an inconvenient truth. I was in Sweden 2 years ago, just as an anecdote as we're coming to the end here, and I went to the Viking Museum. And there's a wonderful map of the world there, and it shows how far the Vikings traveled for trade. And they traveled all the way to Baghdad, according to this map. But there's also this very famous story about King Charles XII, who was fighting against Russia and ended up in exile for 3 years in the Ottoman Empire. And when he returns to Sweden, finally, and it's safe, he announces to his courtiers that he has developed a particular fondness for these small, round balls of meat. We know them today as, of course, the Swedish meatball, this kind of iconic Swedish dish, but they have their origins in the kafta of the Ottoman Empire, because for 3 years when he was sitting there in Istanbul, this is what he was eating. I mean, if you were to try to tell somebody when they go to IKEA that Swedish meatball has its origins in the Turkish kafta, there would probably be some incredible resistance to think, why are you taking credit for our national dish? But that is the truth. It shows the permeability of the human condition and human history throughout time. It seems as though the rupture is coming from where the West wants to deny that reality.
Excellent. We've got one comment on the chat. Saeed, could you have a look at it and share your thoughts?
Which one would you like me to see?
A bit early here. IO, it says, is it right to say the Western modernity start with introduction of paper from the Muslims?
Oh, I mean, that's an interesting that's an interesting thing. So hopefully what we can deduce is that there's no one event that really defines the start of modernity. When I I challenge my students in my course on early Islamic history that when does Islam emerge, I get a bunch of different answers. Some say from a very, very theological perspective, well, from the time of Banu Adam. Others say from the time of the birth of the prophet. Others will say from the time of the first revelation. Others will say from the Hijrah, because that's the year one of the Islamic calendar. And some will even go ahead and say from the establishment of the Caliphate. They all have their reasons for that, and there will be differences of opinion. And I think that here, when it comes to when exactly modernity begins, is perhaps less important than figuring out what were all of these forces and all of these conditions which then conspire to move Europe in a particular direction, one that they were not taking prior to that set of circumstances happening. But paper, look, I mean, in 1458, Gutenberg's establishment of the first movable print press was revolutionary. At the same time, perhaps its significance was a little bit overly made, given the fact that the literacy rate in Europe at the time was probably still quite low.
Thank you, Saeed. With that, I guess we have addressed all the questions that we have on our hand. So again, thank you everyone for making comments and participating in the Q&A session. Our next lecture will be on 27th January, Thursday, on the topic of Islamicate's encounter with Western modernity, colonialism, imperialism, subjugation, decolonization. More details will be shared shortly in our WhatsApp group, so feel free to join in if you haven't done it yet. We thank Professor Saeed for delivering the lecture. We also thank you all for taking part and making valuable contributions in the discussion. We are very much looking forward to seeing you in our next lecture as well. With that, we are closing our session tonight. See you everyone in our next lecture. Goodbye for now.
All right. Assalamu alaikum. Goodbye.